I suspect many of us spend a surprisingly large proportion of our lives wondering what we should wear for the occasions we'll face during the day ahead, be it work or a wedding or a trip to the beach. For work at least, this task has for many people become a fair bit simpler during the pandemic, when we've only had to worry about the parts of our bodies which are visible on our webcams. For the rest, we can wear pretty much what we like. But because of our desire to be dressed appropriately, there is no shortage of experts out there offering fashion advice for different occasions. A group of people which, based on the reading we just heard from the letter to the Ephesians, appears to include St. Paul, here setting out his recommendations for the outfit you should wear for a meeting with the forces of evil. Now, while a very wide variety of meetings does appear in my diary over a typical month, so far I don't recall ever seeing forces of evil on the invitation list for a Teams call. And indeed, the whole concept of evil forces in the form of something we might encounter on a personal level has become rather unfashionable in our modern society. Because while specific groups or people might be referred to as evil, the idea of this somehow less tangible, insidious evil force tends, if it's considered at all, either to be dismissed or to be ridiculed, treated as a superstitious throwback to the Middle Ages. I suspect most people in the world today would be pretty surprised to hear that they're engaged in a struggle with the devil. But yet Paul states pretty much as a fact that each individual Christian will inevitably end up grappling on a personal level with the forces of evil at some point in their life. And this doesn't just mean standing up against those people who seek to exploit creation for their own advantage, those who start wars, who destroy the natural world, who oppress others. It also means stopping evil influencing the trajectory of our own lives. But even though the Bible is pretty unequivocal about the fact that the forces of evil really do exist, and that they really are out to turn our lives away from God, it is still quite easy to be sceptical about the idea of a personal struggle against evil. We might think that, okay, this is something which could happen to other people, but surely not to us. Because yes, we may sometimes find it a little bit difficult to live out our Christian faith in practice, to forgive people, to resist temptation, to pray regularly, to work at developing our relationship with God. But surely that's not anything to do with evil, it's just our own personal inadequacy. Well, for much of the second half of the 20th century, the USSR were often portrayed as the forces of evil in the Western world, with people warned to live in fear of a Soviet nuclear attack. And there's an episode of the sitcom Yes Minister where this is discussed, in the context of whether or not Britain should renew its own nuclear weapons system, something which may have echoes in the modern world. So those who are against spending money on nuclear weapons point out, as part of this argument, that actually, if the Soviets wanted to invade the Western world, they would do their utmost to avoid an all-out nuclear confrontation, and would instead adopt something called salami tactics, where they would make a series of small incursions on Western territory, but never do anything that was in itself big enough to provoke a nuclear response. Now, I don't know whether or not this was true, but I think this is exactly how the forces of evil very often work. In general, they don't adopt the tactics which the devil used when he confronted Jesus in the desert, saying, "Follow me and all this will be yours," demanding a nuclear response where we can denounce them. But instead, they tend to attack through a series of seemingly insignificant nudges. "Yes, I know you really shouldn't do that, but just once won't matter." Or, "You know, so-and-so hasn't really done anything to deserve your forgiveness." Or, "Well, God won't mind if you don't say your prayers just for today." In themselves, these are not a wholesale capitulation to evil. But the problem is, over time, the cumulative impact of these little things moves you further and further away from God, until eventually you are entirely in the grasp of the devil. And once she realised the danger of this, well, then maybe that idea of a personal struggle with evil seems a bit closer to home. Because how evil works is that it takes advantage of people's personal inadequacies to gradually nudge them away from God. Now this may seem a little concerning, but don't worry, because realising what evil is up to is the first step to stopping it. And we do have Paul's fashion tips to help us out in our task of turning back evil. Because helpfully, Paul points out that actually God has equipped us with a whole range of different things which can help us to defeat evil. Now the first thing that Paul mentions is the belt of truth, and I've got a belt here to illustrate this today. Now a belt might seem a bit of an odd place to start, because at first glance it doesn't seem the most crucial item of clothing that we might wear. And indeed, more than once when I've been getting changed in a rush, I've realised that I've forgotten to wear a belt at all. And at first things have seemed fine, but then very soon after I've left the house, I've gradually realised that something was wrong. Because while my trousers will stay up without a belt, they don't feel entirely secure, and the nagging worry that they might then fall down makes it very difficult to concentrate on doing anything else. So perhaps what Paul is using the belt to illustrate is that if we couldn't be sure that the Christian message was true, well then this too would be very distracting, and it would make it hard to focus on our struggle against evil, for we couldn't even be sure that there was anything worth struggling for. Paul, though, clearly demonstrates elsewhere in his writing that the Christian message is true, so this belt of truth holds the rest of our garments in place and allows us to focus on thwarting evil. So secondly, we have the breastplate of God's righteousness. And this breastplate means that we can be sure that God is on our side, that ultimately he will put the world to rights, and that his way is the right way. Wearing it means that we don't need to be afraid to face evil head on and dare it to do its worse. Now next, we put on the shoes of the gospel of peace. Now you'll notice that these are tap shoes. Now when some people, sadly not me, put on these shoes, they are transformed and they can dance about in ways you'd never think they'd be capable of. And similarly, the shoes of the gospel of peace allow us as Christians to make some unexpected moves against evil. Now thinking about the need to fight evil can make some people feel quite uncomfortable, because evil has actually captured a lot of the language of the struggle for itself, meaning that we associate these words with violence and death, things which should never be used to try to advance the church. But the shoes of the gospel of peace remind us of the only effective way to fight evil, the weapons that we use when we fight on God's terms, and the only weapons which can actually win this battle. And these weapons are the gospel of peace and the message of love. So, now we've got our shoes on, what's next? Well, next we can pick up the shield of faith. Now, unsurprisingly, evil is quite prepared to fight dirty and will, as Paul puts it, hurl flaming arrows at you, whether they're doubt, despair, adverse circumstances, temptation, or tragedy. And the aim of these things is to demoralise us and ultimately to defeat us, like the salami tactics we talked about before, gradually wearing us down, so that eventually we despair and turn away from God in the hope of finding earthly salvation. Now these may take the form of a direct frontal assault, but it's probably more likely that they will be a subtle and gradual campaign, persuading us to invest our time and our energy in irrelevant side issues or earthly temptations. But whatever is thrown at us, we can deflect it away with the shield of faith, because that faith in Jesus means we can be sure that whatever happens, our risen Lord will protect us. And further protection is provided by our final item of clothing, the helmet of salvation that is ours because Jesus has already defeated the ultimate enemy, the devil. The devil may struggle on, but Jesus has shown through his resurrection that death has no power over him and no power over his followers, that ultimately evil can't touch us. and so this should give us the courage and the strength to face down evil today. So there's 2 more items remaining on Paul's equipment list, and these allow us to go beyond simply resisting evil and advance to help others as they engage in the same struggle. So the first of these is the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, the gospel through which God accomplishes his powerful cleansing work in people's hearts and people's lives. And this allows us to spread God's message of love and of healing. It allows us to show up the lies and the deceits of evil for what they are, and it allows us to banish it from people's lives and from God's creation. Now, there are many ways we can use this sword actively to advance God's work, but inevitably it will need to be accompanied by the use of our final piece of equipment, which is prayer. Now, I haven't got an object to illustrate prayer, because prayer isn't really tangible and we don't entirely understand how it works. But it is still a crucial tool in overcoming evil, and so, as Paul says, we should pray in the Spirit on all occasions, with all kinds of prayers and requests. Now, I've only had time to skim over the capabilities of these items of clothing. Each of them would repay much closer examination, and as Christians it's important that we learn how to make the best use of each one. Because there is perhaps a risk in such a whistle-stop tour that this could all seem a bit banal. A nice set of metaphors dreamed up by Paul, but not something which is really crucial to our faith. Do 21st century Christians really need to get dressed up in this symbolic and rather archaic outfit in order to live our lives in God's way? Well, yes, I think we do, because while the forces of evil may be many things, they are not banal. It is scarily easy to be distracted, tempted, sidetracked, and tricked into living a life which is increasingly far from the life God calls us to. For our best intentions to be salami sliced away, until we're left only with our regrets for what we should have done. And when these salami slices are multiplied across millions or billions of people, it's perhaps really not surprising that our world is in such a mess. And I think perhaps as a church we do understandably tend to focus on campaigning against the big ticket items. Stop war, prevent famine, save the rainforests. But if, as we do this, we neglect all the little things in our everyday lives which insidiously undermine our efforts, God's kingdom will remain a very long way off. We can't avoid the fact that we do each have to fight against evil. This isn't something we can opt out of and still remain a Christian, because opting out of the fight is the same as giving in. So for each of us there is a warning in Paul's words. But for each of us there is also enormous hope. For Paul shows us that if we do learn to put on the complete armour which God has provided us with, we can stand firm and undismayed, together with other Christians and with God, in the knowledge that ultimately neither the personal attacks nor the wider forces of evil can ever defeat us. As the psalmist said, "A righteous man may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all." Amen.